Welcome everybody to the University Interdisciplinary Colloquium. For those of you who have not been with us before, the University Interdisciplinary Colloquium, or UIC as we call it, is a forum that's organized by the Center for Interdisciplinarity at Michigan State University, which is a center that I direct. I'm Michael O'Rourke, I'm also in the philosophy department here at MSU. And the UIC is sponsored by the College of Arts and Letters, and it's intended to highlight the innovative and important interdisciplinary work involving or related to the arts and humanities at Michigan State. The interdisciplinarity is a major phenomenon, sort of research and practice activity that you find across the academic spectrum. Major research universities have committed, like Michigan State, have committed quite a bit of resources to supporting and furthering the objectives of interdisciplinarity, often though it's code for well-funded complex science. But in our view, some of the best and most influential interdisciplinary work reflects an appreciation for the aesthetic and humanistic dimensions of human experience, broadly construed. The UIC is an attempt really to acknowledge and amplify interdisciplinary contributions that feature these aesthetic and humanistic elements, to kind of highlight the fact that many of the projects that people pursue that address complex problems are projects that center human beings and really require attention to human experience if we're going to do anything sustainable in response to them. We meet every other week during the fall and spring semesters, and so we're going to meet 2 weeks from now at the same time when we will be hearing from Kristen Arola. Kristen is a associate professor in writing, rhetoric, and American cultures, American Indian and Indigenous studies, and also in digital humanities here at Michigan State. Her presentation will be strengthening interdisciplinary collaborations through Indigenous and humanist voices. So that will be in 2 weeks on the 30th of October. Today, though, we're very pleased to have with us Dr. Caitlin Torphy. Dr. Torphy is the lead researcher and the founder of the Teachers and Social Media Project at Michigan State University. This project considers the intersection of cloud to class, nature of resources within virtual resource pools, and implications for equity as educational spaces grow increasingly connected. Dr. Torphy conceptualizes the emergence of a teacherpreneurial guild in which teachers turn to one another for instructional content and resources. She has expertise in teachers' engagement across virtual platforms, teachers' physical and virtual social networks, and education policy reform. Most recently, Dr. Torphy was the PI on a grant with DARPA, examining social media diffusion across Pinterest. She and colleagues convened an American Education Research Association conference in October 2018 here at Michigan State on social media and education with scholars from across the country. She's published work on charter school impacts, curricular reform, teachers' social networks, and also presented work regarding teachers' engagement within social media at the national and international level. She's the editor and an author of 4 special issues, which we were just talking about, on social media and education. Dr. Torphy earned a PhD in education policy, a specialization in the economics of education from Michigan State in 2014. She is a Teach for America alumnus and a former Chicago public schools teacher. Today, Dr. Torphy is with us to deliver a talk entitled Educational Professionalism Within the Fifth Estate, Networks of Influence Across Social Media and Education. Dr. Torphy.
Thank you. Well, I just want to say, thank you so much for having me today. And I was really excited to meet with you last year and talk a little bit about this project and some of the interdisciplinary work that I think we do, and also could be even extended into more of the humanities area. So I'm excited to present to you all and hear your questions or your feedback at the end of this. So Please feel free to put things in the chat. I don't think I'll be able to look at the chat while I'm presenting, but if, I don't know if in the past,
Well,
like somebody monitors the chat and then will interrupt me, or I can always answer at the end as well.
I think Stephanie and I will monitor that, and we'll probably hold on to the questions and comments until after you've concluded, and then have those be part of the Q&A.
Okay, perfect. Great. So as Dr. O'Rourke said, my name's Caitlin Torphy, and oops, let's see here. Let me just make sure that I understand how I'm doing this. Let me share one more time. Okay, so apparently if I push the button, it will just immediately move on, but you saw that I'm the lead researcher for the Teachers in Social Media project. You can check more about that out at teachersinsocialmedia.com or teachersinsocialmedia.org. This is a really unique time because right now we find ourselves in a global pandemic that has forced many of us to stay more or less in our homes or close to our homes. And for the majority of students globally, we have them learning at least partially online or withdrawn from school altogether. So overall, the COVID-19 pandemic has changed education potentially forever. There's been speculation that schools, now that they have identified ways to learn online, things like the snow day may never come back. There's a large degree of variation in access to online learning, both globally, obviously, and also within the United States. And this relates to things such as computer access, access to Wi-Fi, and home learning environments. In our College of Communications at Michigan State, prior to COVID-19, there was a project going on examining Wi-Fi access within the state of Michigan. And we found, even within our own state, a significant degree of variation in Wi-Fi access, with many areas of students in the state having very little access to no access at all. So you can imagine, as we've now moved to many of us online learning, the ability for students to access and engage that learning is significantly declined. There's also a large degree of variation by age in online learning, with early learners struggling more to engage in schooling than older learners. And this has to do with both areas of focus and then also just the ability to access technology in meaningful ways, being able to, for example, type in a website, being able to know how to enter in a username and a password. So just those things alone create a lot of difficulty for many early learners. And then from the teacher side, prior to COVID-19, there was a large and significant variation in digital literacy, with many teachers having, a significant degree of digital literacy, while other teachers may have a very limited degree of digital skills. So therefore, as we've all been pushed into this online learning environment, how teachers are navigating that and supporting their learners is greatly varied. So with that being said, this is the context that we are currently in. And the work that we've done actually predates this context by examining what teachers are doing online prior to COVID. But we also have work going on currently examining what teachers are doing online during COVID. Okay, so in social science, generally, we approach something with a research question, and we can do several things to answer that question. And a question could be something like, how is a teacher planning for her instruction? So we might go into teachers' classroom and observe those teachers. We could, for example, interview teachers and ask them, or we could conduct a survey to survey teachers to identify how they're planning for their instruction. In an era of social media, we can also approach this in another way. So some of the challenges that traditional approaches bring are, if we're observing, can we scale that observation? If we're asking or interviewing teachers, is that something that's scalable? And if it's not scalable, is it reliable outside this one individual's perspective or the sampled individual's perspective? Is it representative of the whole group of teachers that we're interested in answering the question for? Is it a valid measure? Are we asking interview questions or survey questions that make sense? And because when you put yourself in an interviewer or survey position, you as the solicitor are then provoking the person taking the questionnaire or the interview to respond. So is this response an authentic response, or is it something that is affected by observer bias because the respondent may be responding in a particular way to suit the conditions that they find themselves in? In the online universe, we can ask the same question, and many of these challenges, while we're not actually observing the teacher in the classroom, we can observe authentically what a teacher may be doing online within social media for professional purposes in real time, and how they're curating, in this case on Pinterest, curating instruction. So we are able to eliminate some of the problems that we find from the other traditional approaches to social science research. Okay, so in general, we have this connection between a teacher teaching and her students learning. And we would hope that the teacher's planning takes into account the students that she has in her classroom, and that the students' learning is impacted by what the teacher's doing in the classroom. And so in this case, within Pinterest, this is an example of a teacher planning and pinning a particular resource. In this case, it's for learning math facts from addition and subtraction. The teacher can curate these math facts into a particular board that she may create herself. And then this board is connected to her virtual network of peers. And we call this a socialized knowledge community. So this kind of approach balances both the social science and then also the computational science, because we're combining social science approaches to research and big data within the virtual sphere. So the advantages, like I said, are that it's very easily scalable. We can look at differences by region, by the type of school, by the type of sector, be it public or private, charter schools. We get authentic responses from individuals because these individuals are curating resources without considerations to being interviewed or someone surveying them, for example. It's just for their own purposes. And these resources are being curated, these behaviors are happening within real time, and they're continuous, they're across time. So that gives us the volume and velocity that computational scientists are generally looking for. And we can also connect the curation patterns of teachers to a virtual network. But there are challenges to using this type of data. So one challenge is, for example, that the data is generally unstructured, that we are then required to make inferences about the causality if we're answering particular questions like, how does a teacher's planning impact her students' learning? Well, then we need to make an inference about the type of planning that we're seeing online and then what is happening later with their students' learning. And they – obviously, those things take into account different assumptions. So some responses to these challenges might be to integrate other forms of data so that we're not purely looking at virtual behavior only. So that maybe we're integrating the virtual behavior that we're seeing of teachers planning, and we're also integrating that with classroom observation of teachers teaching or students learning over time. So some of the things that we've done with some of the work in our project has been combining teacher survey and virtual behavior, teacher observations of mathematics instruction, for example, and then their virtual curation of mathematics resources, and also what we call secondary administrative data, which is data from like state departments of education on achievement tests, for example, and then combining that or creating a data set that then speaks to how students are learning with that achievement data, and also how teachers are planning who are connected to those students in the same classroom. So by doing these things, we're able to integrate the rich data that has both the observational or the administrative data like achievement components with the virtual data. So we're really understanding who these people are. So we're getting background demographic data on who are the teachers, who are the students in the classrooms, so that we can account for differences or variation in demographic variables such as race or socioeconomic status or region, etc. So that's an example of interdisciplinary work as we currently conceive it. But I wanted to talk about interdisciplinary work and the College of Arts and Letters. And I just, prior to this talk, was brainstorming some ways that I thought there may be congruence between the departments that you have and then also some things that I see in social media. So in the College of Arts and Letters, we have the Writing and American Culture and English departments. Those are two separate departments, but I put them on the same bullet. Philosophy, and in the philosophy department, one of the statements on the page was to critically examine our beliefs about the world and our place in it. Certainly, I think there's a space in social media to understand how that's being portrayed within social media. Art history and design, visual literacy and social media. One of the questions I had was, what are the emotional aspects of visual literacy in social media? How do we see people attempting to portray emotional components of events or perhaps resources or things to draw individuals' attention within social media, and taking a more like art or design focus to that? And then also you have the African Americans and African Studies department within your college. And I wanted to touch on a couple examples of different things from social media. So for example, this here is a picture of fractions, and it's a fractions free printable. You can see there's hearts, smiles, and then 262 likes or votes up for this within this pin. This is from Pinterest. So for example, how is this displaying some type of emotional affect? And then how is it attempting to draw teachers' attention to this particular resource? And how is that different, for example, from the resource that I showed you earlier with the math facts and the addition and subtraction roll and answer? Another example is unlocking the secret code of multiplication memorization. Again, I just typed in multiplication into Pinterest and I found this pin, which came up within the first several pins. And you can see here both how is this attempting to draw individuals' attention, but also what does this say about our beliefs of who's successful in mathematics? What kind of students are they choosing here? It's, first of all, it's an Asian boy. So what does that say about equity or opportunities to learn for all races of students and all genders of students? One could look at the visual aspects here. Another one, which we've done a paper on, is culturally responsive teaching. And in the work that we did, we went on to another social media site called Teachers Pay Teachers, which is in essence like a teaching eBay, to identify how many resources are culturally representative, that say they're culturally representative, that are posted online by teachers. And what we found was that when we typed in that phrase, culturally representative instruction, which is meant to address explicitly issues of equity and diversity and integrate that into the curriculum, there were actually very few resources, like less than 500, I believe at the time, resources in a website that had over millions of resources. And then in addition to that, the number of resources that actually identified culturally responsive instruction accurately was less than 5. So the number of misconceptions we saw even within that small sample of work was significant. So here's another example of a pin. And certainly there's definitely a lot of opportunity within social media to look for what are culturally responsive teaching resources that are being pinned? How are those actually representing the connections that we want people to be making about diversity, equity, and social justice? So these are just a couple, but I would be really interested to hear your ideas later after the talk. So overall, just some ideas and a recap of what we can do with big data and social media. First of all, I think that it's best to really think of this as rich data. So you don't want only virtual data. In general, to create an interdisciplinary and holistic idea about what's happening within a particular research area or field, it's important to integrate multiple forms of data. And these data can provide a window into, in this case, what we're talking about today is teachers' thinking. They can be continually updated in real time and can be collected without observer bias. So some things that we've done within our project are examining a federal curricular reform, examining how teachers plan and connect with one another in bounded, meaning school-based, and unbounded, virtually based social networks. And then using computational science approaches to identify changes or characterize the quality of mathematics instruction. Okay, so today I just want to talk about one paper that we have, which is called Educators Meet the Fifth Estate. And this paper came out in Teachers College Record in the special issue for 2019, the last volume that year. So we're going to get into our time machine and we're going to look at social change now and in the past. So prior to today, in medieval times, things were a bit different, with a hierarchy of knowledge and information diffusion, where in most places, the clergy was at the top of the hierarchy, and we had a connection there between monarchy, nobility, and at the very bottom were the commoners. Or if you lived in England and had Henry VIII as your king, then potentially you had the monarchy at the top and then the clergy and the nobility, with the commoners still at the bottom. And the sphere of influence was here. With the advent of the Gutenberg press, which has been compared by many writers to the advent of the internet and Web 2.0, we entered into this era of media influence, with reporters joining the sphere of influence, coined as the fourth estate, and the sphere of influence grew to here. Still, though, we have commoners outside of this space. So this paper conceptualizes the fifth estate. It builds on work that was developed in the Department of Communications, actually. So just again, echoing that interdisciplinary nature. And here we see the branches of government, which have now replaced the clergy, the monarchy, the nobility in present day. The fourth estate is mass media. And then this fifth estate is networks upon networks of influence within social media. And the sphere of influence has grown to incorporate public here. So in education, we can consider the fifth estate as a space where individuals are empowered to directly influence and challenge traditional conceptions of professionalism for education and also reform. So we can imagine that schools as public institutes are within this public space, as are teachers and students and community. In the paper we wrote, we went and actually talked to teacher candidates who were ready to enter into the field of teaching and in their very last semester of university coursework here at Michigan State. And what they said, in general, they were asked about to complete an exercise related to engaging in curation of instructional resources within social media, and then to reflect on how they see social media contributing to their professional practices. So what do they think about social media? You can see here, in general, without social media, the majority of teacher candidates believed that we would suffer because that is where they saw their conduit for instructional resources and professional support. And in general, across all of our work, what we find is the unbounded network influence within social media here takes precedent over the trusted educational organizations in industry and their influence here. So prior to Web 2.0 and social media, the hierarchy generally was coming and information diffusing from here to the administrator and through the school and then to the teachers. And teachers certainly had influence on one another within their school, but generally reform and change was happening from this space. Now we have a much more like fire hose approach where teachers can get information from a variety of spaces and be influenced and influence one another within their school and also in the virtual sphere. So I think most people at this point are familiar with social media and Pinterest, but just to recap, you can store your resources, you can scrapbook them in different boards that you create, and you can follow and become followers for one another. So it explicitly facilitates a social network connection and allows individuals to repin instructional resources, which gives us that explicit diffusion mechanism. In general, the majority of teachers across our survey and other surveys conducted by the National Center for Mathematics and RAND are engaging in social media and particularly in Pinterest for instructional resource curation. And engagement is often frequent, with over 50% of teachers reporting at least once a week. They're also engaging in other social media and for different purposes. So for example, in our sample, we found the majority of teachers engaged in Pinterest for acquiring resources or sharing versus Twitter to stay engaged or on top of educational things happening. This is an example of another social media space, Teachers Pay Teachers, and you can see here that there's just a large array of resources that are available on any particular topic. So you can imagine during COVID, what are individuals doing? Individuals are probably going to multiple different spaces, including Teachers Pay Teachers, to get resources for their students in this new space where they need instructional resources that aren't necessarily meant for face-to-face environments. So overall, some of the themes that we saw emerging from the fifth estate and the idea of embedded networks of influence within social media were notions of teachers having increased autonomy, having increased creativity or flexibility in what they can do in their instruction. This notion of teacher to teacher trust, which was extremely important and basically can be recapped by saying teachers felt confident that if they were receiving instructional resources from another teacher, for example, through a teacher blog or through Teachers Pay Teachers, that this resource was going to be high quality because this teacher is similar to me. They are in the classroom every day, so they understand the types of like problems or challenges that teachers may encounter. And therefore they were more confident in that than going to one of what I had showed before, like a trusted, historically trusted educational organization. And that speaks to this idea of credibility. Teachers also noted that they were more able to modify resources, and many of them intended to modify resources as they pulled them offline and adapted them to their own local context. And finally, that was in response to their students' learning. So if we think about the teacher and the students that were in the picture I initially showed, and hopefully that the teacher is planning in response to their students and the students are learning in response to their teachers' actions, then that's one of the things that you can see coming through here. So all of these things were supported within the fifth estate of the networks of individuals within social media. I have another paper that uses literature related to guilds to examine how teacherpreneurial behavior is basically circumventing hierarchies of diffusion, but I might skip this for time to make sure that we have time for questions. So I'm not sure. What are you guys thinking related to the chat? Because I haven't been looking at the chat. So
we can typically we try to have the talk end at about 20 till. So you have another 5 minutes if there or 5 minutes worth of like summative remarks you want to make, or if there's a quick tour through that paper, that'd be fine.
Okay, great. Then I will just review here. We had our research question was, who do teachers turn to when seeking out and accessing supplemental instructional resources? And again, using an interdisciplinary lens, we went back to examine work done on professional guilds to try to frame what we were seeing in present day related to virtual behavior. And what we found is that guilds often establish norms, they're sharing expertise, they create consensus around their practices, and they directly engage in decision making. And generally, the guild dynamic would look something like this, where the state, the market, and the profession are interacting and influencing one another. So we saw similar behavior happening within virtual spaces, what we called virtual resource pools, where teachers can access a variety of instructional resources. And what we saw is that here is the Teacherpreneurial Guild sitting right in the middle of the state, which you can consider like a federal or state influence on educational reform, the marketplace, which might be places like curricular materials that are for profit, and then the traditional educational professions here. So we used big data methods to pull Pinterest curation from 197 teachers from the origin of their accounts on Pinterest to 2016, which amounted to approximately 135,000 pins across nearly 15,000 educational sites. And then we came up with a way to characterize the types of variation we were seeing across sites, including these teacher-to-teacher markets, such as Teachers Pay Teachers or other places where teachers can sell their content, educational blogs, and traditional educational organizations. And what we found is that the majority of teachers were accessing resources from other teachers. So teachers were turning to one another rather than educational organizations such as, for example, Michigan State or the National Education Association for Teachers to get their instructional resources and professional support. So what does that mean? We found, again, teacher-to-teacher trust to be a big component of directing the behavior of teachers. And this was despite differences in geography or differences in school demographics or professional affiliations. So thinking about that today, how can we use social media as an artifact to understand what individuals are doing within education during the COVID-19 pandemic? And how might social media interact as an artifact during this pandemic? What might be the affordances of using social media to examine what teachers are doing to meet their students' needs, or in fact, actually parents as well, as parents have in many cases become teachers for their students during this time. So putting out a question to you all after seeing this presentation, what are some of the research questions you could think about to ask? Or what types of data do you think you might need to answer them? And then I have a couple other slides, but I don't know that there's time, but we're also working on building a nationally representative sample of teachers, and we're nearly finished. We only have 4 more states left to go, and we'll have a nationally representative sample of teachers based on a US Census with this was our number of pins, a little over almost 4 million pins. And probably by the time we're done with this, it'll be close to 3,000 teachers nationwide. So we have data, and I'm interested in hearing people's thoughts and feedback and any research questions that you think might be interesting to ask. Thank you.
Thank you, Caitlin. All right, so we will, at this point, open things up to the audience for comments. There is a question in the Q&A that I'll read from Sonia Fritchie, who's Associate Dean in the College of Arts and Letters. And Sonia asks, as you mentioned earlier in your presentation, you noted the digital divide. How would this be added into your model, which seems to assume, oops, just lost it, there it goes. Seems to assume a homogeneous fifth estate and still leaves out a large enough public in the US and even more so globally. Right, so, right there, okay, so I'll just leave that question for you.
Okay, well, thank you. That's a great question. It's nice to virtually meet you. Sonia, thank you for coming. So I did note the digital divide, and I do think that in the model that I had for the fifth estate, we don't discuss explicitly the digital divide. But now in today's climate, it seems more important to address this issue. In the fifth estate paper, that paper was not a quantitative piece, that was a qualitative piece. So I guess that the fifth estate paper is more theoretical and not necessarily the data and the responses that we receive from individuals wouldn't be representative of those people who are left out of the digital divide. But in papers moving forward, like for example, in the nationally representative model that I just showed you that we're building the sample, in thinking about how teachers who we are not able to sample and what that means. Like, how does that relate to other factors that we're seeing related to geography? Like, what schools are these teachers coming from? What's the grade levels that these teachers are coming from that we're missing? What types of student demographics are we seeing these teachers who are not in our sample? Like, who are they serving and coming from? So those are some of the things that we've been keeping track of by combining the census data on schools within the schools that are in our sample. And then we've been identifying both the teachers that we're able to sample within social media, and then also those that we're not able to find. And so there's definitely going to be some type of selection in those that we're not able to find. Some of it may be due to the fact that they have a common name and therefore we just can't identify them because their name is like John Doe and there's a million John Does or something. But there may also be the fact that there is some type of systematic bias happening. And so even just being able to put a name to specific variables that are related to that, I think would be important. I think you're muted.
I am muted. Not anymore, though. So Kenneth Frank asks, how is teachers' use of resources on Pinterest changing with COVID, and how do you think the resources on Pinterest will change as a result of COVID?
Okay. I don't have causal data to answer this question, but I will answer the question, and then maybe we can actually use data to make sure that my hypothesis may be correct. I think that teachers' use of resources on Pinterest is probably increasing related to COVID-19. And I think it's increasing not just on Pinterest, but probably in general on most of the online instructional sites that you can access materials. And I think that this may be some type of tipping point that you could see individuals using more individually like created resources or entrepreneurial created resources rather than from these large nonprofit organizations such as Scholastic or Harcourt Mifflin, which is like a large curriculum producer, that those things will begin filtering in more to schools and institutions formally, because as teachers have been asked to curate their own curriculum in this pandemic situation, they'll come back to school face to face and say, hey, you know, this really worked for me. And let me share with my colleagues about this. And let's see, you know, is this something that would work for our team? Is this something that would work for our school? So I think in general, we may see more variation across schools in curriculum after COVID than we did before COVID.
I have a question that I'd like to ask. So you talked about socialized knowledge communities and how the interaction on social media can help to create socialized knowledge communities for the purposes, at least in part, of enabling resource sharing. And I'm curious how much you've learned about the nature of these communities. Like it, you know, within the Center for Interdisciplinarity, we spend a lot of time thinking about collaborative research. So teams conducting research projects. So I'm curious if they're, you know, if you paid attention to the collaborative nature of these networks. I mean, are there better and worse ways of organizing these knowledge communities for the purposes of supporting instruction, K-12 instruction?
That's a great question. We have, so one of my graduate students is actually writing a dissertation examining the differences in information diffusion from bounded and unbounded networks. And it's extended, her dissertation is extending a paper that we wrote and published together where we look at common resources that teachers are sharing within one school that we had actually gone into, observed teachers teaching, and we surveyed teachers and we identified who are the closest colleagues within your school. We asked teachers to name other individuals they're working with within their school. And then we compared, okay, are those individuals also individuals they're connected with online? And then also there are individuals that I'm teaching within my school that I'm not connected with online. And what we found, which was surprising, was that teachers were significantly influenced in their resource curation by their colleagues that they were working with in their schools, in their like close network. So that wasn't surprising. But what was more surprising was that they were doubly influenced by those teachers who were not within their close network, but were working with in their school. So in essence, if you and I are closely working together, I probably know most of what you have. And so I may not need to collect or repin something that you've pinned because I can just go next door and talk to you. But if you and I are working in the same school and maybe I'm watching you from afar, or I'm admiring your work, but I might be too nervous to come talk to you, or I just don't have enough time, then I might repin your resources. I'm more likely to repin your resources in that case. So when we think about the types of collaborative networks that we build, I think it's not just the network that we formally support, but it's also the connections that might be one step removed from those people within the network that if I hear about a colleague that you've told me about, I may be more likely to then seek out resources or information from them.
Great. Thank you. I have a couple of comments in the chat. Our questions in the chat. First from Stephanie Vasco, who's the Managing Director of the Center for Interdisciplinary. Stephanie asks, from a big data perspective, will you be using your data to make predictions or to model, perhaps with machine learning, these communities?
For the socialized knowledge communities, I would imagine she's
Yeah,
saying.
I think so, right? The socialized knowledge communities.
So right now we've been working on building the nationally representative sample, and we're almost completed with that. Some of the work that one of our students in computer science has been doing for his papers and now building up to a dissertation is actually using machine learning techniques to actually build out socialized knowledge communities. So to connect or recommend teachers to one another that are very similar or working on similar resources that should be talking or should be seeing one another's work. So that's one thing that we've been doing. Another thing, as I said, is that Yu-Ching Liu, who's a student of ours, is also working on a dissertation to see the effects of information diffusion, and the social network that you hold within virtual space, and see how that compares to the social network that you hold within physical space, and looking at the full virtual sphere of network users. And that means those people that are educators and also those people who are not educators, just everyone that you're connected with within social media, and see how that relates to the type of resources that you curate. So that will also use computational approaches. It's basically like, it's called a relational event model, but it's kind of like a hazard model to identify what the potential hazard is of repinning something based on your affiliation with this person in a particular network. But I definitely think there's a lot more potential that could be done in thinking about how networks impact individuals' engagement, and also that both relates to face-to-face networks and then the virtual networks, and then that space that's in between, which during COVID has become so much more salient.
Great. Yeah, your colleague Yu-Ching Liu says in the Q&A, says, yes, we think of access to resources based on online connections as an important social capital, and for organizing the socialized knowledge community. Resource flow put connected teachers on the same page, which creates consistency in resources and later adoption in the local school context.
Great.
So I think an additional comment to supplement your answer. A question from Chet McCleskey, who's also a part of the Center for Interdisciplinarity. One of the things I've noticed is that in the scramble for teachers to assemble materials that work online as well as in person, there's a lack of cohesion in the lessons. Teachers end up teaching subjects for which they can find decent resources rather than finding resources that fit a lesson plan they've created. This seems especially true in science, where students might study the digestive system in one week, but in another week study erosion in ecosystems. I wonder if you have seen this phenomenon in your research and if you have any thoughts on it.
So I haven't explicitly seen so first of all, as a parent, I can say that I have explicitly seen this myself in my own students, my kids learning as well online since COVID-19. So I feel exactly what the comment is speaking to. But also, one of the papers we wrote, we didn't look at science, but we looked at mathematics, and we looked at how teachers were incorporating social media resources to supplement math instruction. And what the teacher did was, we actually were lucky enough to go in and observe this teacher in the classroom as well, to see them enact the social media resource that they had curated. But this teacher specifically had one resource that she put into practice to support students' understanding of coins and using money for transactions in early elementary, in 3 days. So the first day they did work with money, and there was some type of worksheet related to money. And then the second day they did like some type of real world problem solving that had, again, it was questions on a worksheet that had been developed by another teacher, and they had curated from Teachers Pay Teachers. And then on the third day, they actually went into their local newspaper and cut out clippings of different food to create a dinner, and then figure out how much money they would need to buy the ingredients for the dinner, and add all of the coins and the dollars together. And this was like a 3-day lesson to supplement the learning. But that takes a lot of planning and work. And I think that for that teacher, this was prior to COVID-19, she saw a need that students needed more practice with money. And so she was able to find and supplement that need with this particular resource. But when we think about doing that for every single subject, for every single day, and some schools have given teachers more or less support than others, I think it's a large task for teachers. And particularly if you're in science and you're teaching multiple grade levels, then you might need to do that every single day for multiple grade levels as well.
Thank you, Kaitlin. Question from Marissa Rinkus, also a member of the Center for Interdisciplinarity. In your sample that you're building or your past research, do the teachers know that data from their Pinterest accounts is being used? Are there follow-up surveys or interviews with these teachers to ask how they are using or not using what they pin?
It depends on the sample. Some of our samples know that the data from their Pinterest accounts are being scraped by us. And some teachers from the sample, from other samples, do not know. And that just relates to whether or not we had these teachers in a more like direct contact sample. Like one of our samples was from a National Science Foundation grant, where we were surveying teachers, observing them in their classrooms. So we were in direct communication with them already. And so in that case, those teachers did know. But in other cases of samples we've pulled, they do not know. And so that actually relates to ethics, which we have done a lot looking at Pinterest's privacy agreement, and also just looking at ethics of using big data, which is a changing quickly field, and thinking about how does our research follow the required ethics when you use big data. So one of the things you have to consider is contextual integrity. And that means how the information flow could threaten informational norms that have been entrenched over time. So when I pin something, do I pin that with knowledge that this may be used for another purpose by someone else? And if that's not my expectation, then it's up to the researcher following contextual integrity, even if it's public data, to then protect anonymity of that individual. And so this graphic here shows a process we use to de-identify all of our schools and our teachers to make sure that they are anonymous, and then also report results, any results we do at the aggregate level, so that there's no possible way that individuals could be identified. Particularly with social network results, that's important because sometimes if you have a small enough network, and elementary schools certainly are small, you might say, I mean, there's only 4 second grade teachers, so I can kind of figure out who this is if there happens to be someone who reads the journal. So that's one of the things we think about, is this contextual integrity. And we have had, just to answer the second question briefly, we have done follow-up interviews with teachers to ask how they're using or not using what they pin. We haven't done any manuscripts on this other than the one that I just discussed using the counting, and there is a publication on that. But we do have interviewed data on that. And mostly it's just been used to develop our quantitative, like theoretical frame that we create.
All right. Well, we are almost at an end. I thank you very much, Kaitlin, for your presentation and for your responses to the questions. Really grateful to have you be a part of the UIC, and good luck to you and your team and the work that you're doing, especially, like you say, given the context, the pandemic, and the fact that so many teachers are now doing work online. This is such an important project. So good luck. We hope that we see all of you next in 2 weeks on the 30th, when we'll be hosting the next UIC.
Thank you. I just wanted to say thank you to Yu Ching Liu and Ken Frank, who are colleagues, to them as well, and to all the other people on my project. And thank you for having me again. It's really been fun talking to you all.